What's the most important thing for a new player whenever they pick up a new title? Is it a welcoming community, guides, or tutorials on how certain game mechanics work? A welcoming community that'll open their arms wide open, the tools needed to progress or get to the next level. These are some of the most important questions for any newcomer, and I would like to talk about that in Space Marine 2 and how it deals with new players. So the other day I was sitting in the battle barge and I decided to look at the Accolade shop. It dawned on me, I have everything in the Accolade shop. I'm not trying to flex on anybody, but I want to ask newer players, how daunting of a task is this for newer players? Like, how overwhelming can this be? So I've been playing the game for a while, and it's easy to get these things. I have my Accolades stockpile pretty much for every patch. But what happens for newer players? Really put yourself in the shoes of a newcomer. I mean, this has to be overwhelming. I mean, this is just one part of the whole game. I'm not even talking about leveling up your weapons, getting all your points to unlock new weapons, leveling up your classes, prestiging on your classes, in the ordeals. Oh my god. I mean, that has to be overwhelming. Space Marine 2 is very popular right now. With the introduction of the Switch port, I have been seeing a lot more new players lately when I'm queuing up for random queues, and that's great. The more the merrier. I love to see this game at the very top. I'm very looking forward to Space Marine 3. I do think that Space Marine 2 does offer a very good introduction, especially if you're new to Warhammer like I was. I remember when I was introduced to this game, I booted up the game. I didn't know anything about Warhammer, and my first thought was to jump into the campaign. First of all, if you are a new player and you're watching this, welcome to the Warhammer community. If this is your introduction to Warhammer like it was for me, I really do hope you stay and enjoy your time. This series is so fantastic. The lore just runs so deep. It's like no other franchise out there right now. So I really appreciate that about Warhammer. Space Marine 2 does a fantastic job at its difficulty. That's where it really shines. That's where it really stands out. If we just take a look at the select difficulty here, Space Marine 2 really lets you outlive a fantasy, destroying hordes of aliens and chaos, all with your battle brothers, chain sword in one hand, bolt pistol in the other. In Space Marine 2, I think it really shines when it comes to this difficulty level. I'm looking at it right now. We start off at minimal, and it does end up giving you a recommended level for each difficulty that you progress to. I think for most new players that start off on the lowest difficulty and try to make their way up, it's very satisfying. Like, you get to a point where you look at yourself and you say, hey, that was kind of easy. Maybe it's time to move up to average. Then you go to substantial. When you feel comfortable with substantial, you go to ruthless. You're getting better at killing extremists. You can really take on terminus fights without dying. Then it's time to go to lethal. You really got lethal down. In lethal, it's that sweet spot, not on absolute level, but it's such a good introduction to absolute. I'll be the first to say it. I'm not really a fan of how they ended up splitting the accolades between PvP and siege mode. I really wish they would have just stuck with, getting all your accolades on the weekly stratagems. Some of these stratagems, they can take up for quite a bit of time, and not everyone has all the time in the world. Maybe, you have an extra hour, you're able to complete the normal weekly, or maybe even do the hard weekly. Now, all the accolades are split between siege and PvP, which I don't know how to feel about that. I don't mind that they're trying to get more players, or have more incentives to play PvP or even siege. I know PvP because that's been kind of untouched for almost a year now. I would love to really hear your guys' thoughts about how they split accolades between all these game modes. I really do wish they just kept it on the weekly stratagems instead of dispersing it between all these game modes. Now, for newer players, if they want to get their accolades and they try to do the weekly weekly normal stratagem, you know, it's not 200 accolades anymore. Now it's diluted, and if they want to get more, they can do the dailies. But I don't think the dailies offer a lot, especially the newer players. You know, they're probably going to end up going to Siege or going to trying out PvP to get the rest of their accolades done. So in the upcoming year 3, we are supposed to be getting a progression rework, and I do hope it makes more leveling up a lot more easier. You know, that doesn't matter so much as for to me, but as for newer players, you know, it is quite the grind. I have to admit, it is quite the grind having to level up all your weapons, level up your classes, prestige your classes. I mean, that is quite a long activity. You know, that can take hours, and I really wish that could be lowered or have a different way to get through it much faster than we have now. There's so much that Space Marine 2 gets right. I do think that it's slacking on the progression system side though, you know, with leveling up your weapons, getting accolades. You know, I wish there were more opportunities to get accolades, like with the community events. I wish those were more often. I wish there was better ways to level up your weapons, you know, prestige. It's a grind, and I do really feel for the newer players that are picking up this game, and they want to dedicate some time into this game, and it is quite the grind. And I do hope that in year 3 that they end up looking back at it and, you know, giving it a closer look, maybe even reworking it, maybe give us a more faster, more efficient way to level up our classes or level up our weapons, maybe even get more accolades. I would also welcome that if we got more opportunities to get more accolades. I know they kind of did this with PvP in Siege mode, but I think for newer comers, they are going to need a bigger boost of accolades, because just look at the accolade store. I mean, it's huge now, you know, and this is patch 14.1. Imagine what it's going to look like in 2 patches, 3 patches. You know, it's going to be super overwhelming for new players if they don't get another boost of accolades. Let's talk about the community and how well it does with newer players jumping into the game every day. The community of Space Marine 2 is so welcoming to newer players of all kinds. You know, I've seen refugees from Destiny 2, you know, Dark Souls players, especially Dark Souls players. You know, I can see why they want to pick up a game like this. It's similar, but, you know, Space Marine 2 is its own thing, and this community handles newcomers so well. You know, I see on Reddit, you know, just amazing posts, the people praising certain players that, you know, maybe show them some new things, show them the road. You know, if you need to look up a guide or a tutorial on anything, on maybe a specific mechanic, maybe how to deal with mortal wounds, maybe you're unfamiliar with that, maybe somebody in game can tell you about that, or you can look it up. You know, there's so much online, so many resources. Everyone's willing to help a brother out. I think that's why I love this community so well. For my newer players that aren't really aware of the history of Space Marine 2, one of the biggest moments was when Saber released the voice pack. A lot of people weren't happy with the quality of it. They promised us there was going to have a lot of voice lines with this voice pack, and what it ended up being was it was taking into account the different languages with all those different voice lines. So on paper it looked really good. In actual play, it was very limited to what we were promised. And so the community, we got together, you know, we really put our foot down and we said, hey Saber, this really isn't like you to put out a piece of DLC of this quality. And so Saber, absolutely amazing from Saber, you know, they ended up giving a refund to everybody and just making the voice pack just flat out free for everybody, which was pretty huge. That was such a huge moment for everybody. You know, I really thought to myself, man, I'm really grateful to be a part of this community that, you know, we really came together and we said no to Saber. Now, when they release more future DLC, they're going to look back on this moment and make sure that doesn't happen again. Because if it does, you know, we're not just going to sit there and take it. You know, we're going to say something again. That's what I love so much about this. I really do like that this game appeals to, you know, veteran players, you know, beginners, intermediate, you know, it appeals to all types of players. You know, we have the ordeal grind for being mostly the end game stuff. I do wish there was a little more for the newcomers, like more accolades, getting more accolades from certain events, better leveling system. Hopefully we get a different leveling system than the prestige one that we have, like the regular Call of Duty mode. Not really a big fan of that. Hopefully that can change in year 3. But I do think Saber is doing a really good job, and you know, I'm pretty happy that they're the ones running the show for Space Marine 2. I can't think of any other company that would do this well. Saber does have a really good track record of post-launch support for a lot of their games. For really good examples, World War Z, you know, that's a pretty old game already, and it still gets a lot of support even today.